Welcome, we're joined by political consultant Eric Hacopian. We'll be discussing some general topics to do with the aftermath of the 2020 Karabakh war. Eric, welcome back.
It's a pleasure.
So to start off with regards to the current political crisis, do you think there are any constitutional ways or other mechanisms that can allow this crisis to be resolved in a democratic and legal manner?
Well, it can only be resolved in a constitutional and legal manner. There's no other way to resolve it. And no other way is acceptable to resolve it. I mean, there's multiple, from a legalistic standpoint, the issue with the changing government is that Nicol has a 5-year mandate. You can say, and his party, My Step, and you can say the times have changed, but for all legal purposes, they can stay in power for another 3 years, and then nobody can do anything about it as long as he holds his party members. It's as simple as that. However, there's obviously a demand for change by many people. There's been suggestions about Eric Hacopian, I think, suggested some sort of a coalition government.
What do you think about the prospect of a national unity government?
I'm all for. I mean, listen. The only question we ever need to ask about that is who are you excluding? If you're excluding the worst elements of the old regime, fine. And then you ask a positive question: are you getting the best and the brightest from the country and around the world to deal with our crisis? If so, yes, it's a good thing. But you need to tell us who's not part of this. That's the most important thing. And second of all, are you going to go and find the best and the brightest and create, sort of it would be sort of a technocratic government that is focused on the crisis of today. I think that's the one short-term option. The other mid-term option is some kind of an election that will allow. Obviously, the current parliament is not reflective of the country. The prime minister does not have 70–80% support of the country, and these are not ordinary times. So obviously, there's a decent case to be made that he needs to go get a new mandate, especially when you're entering negotiations. And I think this is key. If we're going to be negotiating things that matter for decades, and maybe centuries, depending on what it is, you better have everyone on board. This is not something that you're going to do alone with some 2-year mandate. So again, going back to first principle, unity government's fine. Tell us who you're keeping out. And 2, if you're going to go out and get the best from around the world to run this government.
And Armenians are dealing now with a completely new status quo, completely new borders. The borders and the status quo remained relatively unchanged since the 90s. So how should Armenia and Armenians kind of swallow this, deal with this?
Well, I mean, listen, this needs to be approached in a practical manner. Part of the problem is that the Armenia-Azerbaijan border has not mattered. The actual technical Armenia-Azerbaijan border has not mattered in 30 years. And frankly, you can make the argument that it hasn't mattered since the 1920s because they were all part of one country during that time. And given that the mapping techniques and the exact what's what was quite imprecise when these maps were being drawn, there's like border disputes between Georgia and Azerbaijan and their friendly countries. So what you really need is a formal relationship or a formal commission and an international mediating process that actually comes and draws what is the actual border. And if you need to give here and take there, that's how these things get resolved. But it would require direct negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, hopefully, and most likely with intermediary parties, to draw the finalized line. But at this point, this confusion is not surprising. It should come as no surprise to anyone. And hopefully it doesn't lead to any kind of a military confrontation.
And some people seem to overlook this, but the current agreement is a ceasefire agreement and not a final peace agreement.
Yes.
Do you think a final peace agreement is likely, 1? And 2, how should Armenia prepare for this?
I have no way of knowing if it's permanent. Listen, we don't hold any cards here. If we have a peace agreement, it depends on 2 variables. To what extent is Azerbaijan willing to take its advantageous position and freeze it by saying we're going to finalize this situation, which I don't have any particular hopes of them doing it because of the language and the rhetoric that comes out of that country. The second one is, which is the more important one, is how much will the world powers, in this case Russia, EU, and the United States, given the fact that there's nothing for Armenia to give, all they give is on the other side, to what extent are they willing to pressure the Azeris into coming up with some level of independence, some level of differentiation from Azerbaijan that meets our minimum qualifiers, which is that the people who live there, the Artsaksis, are protected. They can live peacefully in their land, and they are not under Azeri rule. So these are variables that, unfortunately, given the defeat and the fact that during the defeat, we had to give back all of these other territories, we have no cards at the table. But at the same time, when you enter negotiations, the moment these negotiations start, it's bad for them and good for us, because everything that was bad, everything that we were going to give, we already gave. So the issue is how much are they willing to give to finalize it? And Aliyev he's as popular as he's ever going to be. If he's ever going to say, listen, this is the way to settle this issue, it is now. Mm-hmm. Has he shown any level of statesmanship or being sort of a grand man of history, a grand scale political leader in history? Absolutely not. He talks and acts like a third-rate, fascist dictator. Mm. So I don't expect anything from him on that level. But the world powers, again, the countries in this part of the world are, small players, and it's very hard to tell the Americans and the EU and the Russians no when they want to hear yes.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev has spoken yesterday, I believe, about a railway between Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan. Nakhichevan, of course, is the Azerbaijani exclave. There's also been talk about corridors for Armenia through Azerbaijan to Iran and Russia. Has anything taken place to ready the populations for this eventuality?
Of course not.
What needs to be done? I mean, there's talk of this, but it seems so alien, I think, to most people in the South Caucasus.
The populations in this part of the world are never prepared for anything, because no one effectively communicates what needs to be done, what is likely to happen. That skill set simply doesn't exist, or the desire for that skill set doesn't exist. So no, nothing's been done to prepare these things. As far as the specifics of what Aliyev says, I think we should be very careful, because at the end of the day, his comments are. He has an audience that he can never be contradicted, and he can change his story 3 times a day, and it doesn't matter, because he's a dictator in a country that he owns. So reading too much into it, I give as much credence to what he says as as the collective words of Muammar Gaddafi. It is what it is. He can change his. So what he doesn't say is more relevant than what he says. Now, leaving that aside, I think anything that establishes corridors of transportation, especially through Nakhichevan to Iran, anything through Azerbaijan to Russia, anything that opens up either direction, as long as it's negotiated and not done at the point of a gun, like happened to us on that road through Mehri, is a good thing. And anything that cuts out our isolation from the world and provides more transportation links is a good thing that everybody should be for, as long as it is negotiated and you give something and you get something. But the trade, I keep going back to this. There's a long history of people, that trade over time opens up relationships and makes it harder for wars to start. So we should not be against this under any scenario, as long as it's negotiated and we gain as much as they do.
And finally, are there any examples of countries that were defeated militarily that overcame the situation to become thriving societies that Armenia can look to for inspiration?
Oh, plenty. Frankly, there's more examples of the losing side that comes out historically as the winning side after time and development takes shape. You can look at the difference between Russia and Sweden. Sweden, after losing to Peter the Great, went on to become this great insular industrial power and the world's most leading social democracies. You can see Finland and the Soviet Union, and who lives better today, the Russians or the Finns. You can look at the American occupation of Japan and where Japan is today. So yes, absolutely, that road exists, but I think those analogies have their limits. because almost all of those countries, all of those examples that I give, you were dealing with powers that were not as hostile or genocidal as our neighbors. So I think, yes, there's definitive examples of countries that after losing a war become very thriving societies. But then again, those societies did not have the neighbors to the east and west of us that we do. So I think the possibility is there, but I don't think we should ever let our guards down, because that could change in a minute.
Right, Eric, thank you again.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.